Unit 731, one of the most terrifying secrets of the 20th century. The history of Unit 731 begins with one man, Shiro Ishii. Ishii was an extremely bright young man in Japan and gained entrance to Kyoto Imperial University. Something that is important to know about Ishii is that he was close to 6 feet tall. That might seem like a useless piece of information, but for the Japanese, who are generally speaking not too tall, he was like a stern tower of a giant, demanding attention and respect wherever he went. In 1922 Ishii had returned to Kyoto Imperial University to further his education and knowledge of bacteriology, serology, preventive medicine, and pathology. That same year he was sent to Kyushu. There, a highly contagious disease had become extremely aggressive and claiming many lives. The disease caused a severe amount of swelling to the brain and was extremely difficult to study. Ishii approached the problem from a different direction. Rather than studying the disease, he was unable to do so efficiently because the problem lay in the brain where he was unable to get to before the patients died. He studied how to prevent effective water filtration so that soldiers weren't drinking liquid parasites. He did this well, and because of it received much acclaim from his colleagues, and it is said that he even demonstrated how his product worked in front of the Emperor of Japan himself. Supposedly Ishii swore by his filtration so much that he urinated in the filter and then proceeded to drink the clean water the filter produced. In April of 1928 Ishii left Japan to travel the world for 2 years studying. Ishii visited clinics and laboratories in almost 30 countries. He went everywhere from Russia to America, Germany, and France. He returned with information he believed would drastically alter the fate of Japan. Because of Ishii's strong ties with prominent officials such as Colonel Chikahiko Koizumi, who would soon be the Army's Surgeon General and later on become Japanese Health Minister, Colonel Tetsuzan Nagate, who would soon become Chief of the War Ministry's Military Affairs Bureau, and Nobuyoshi Araki the War Minister, he was able to receive funding for projects he believed would result in Japan emerging as world leader. In 1930 when Ishii returned from his trip, Koizumi, who had long been pushing the idea of funding a project for chemical and biological warfare. Koizumi, a soldier, was not as respected as other militants because he was a surgeon, and surgeons at the time had no weapon they could use in war. Koizumi would use Ishii as his tool to change all of these notions the war officials had. After the Manchurian incident, the official Japanese occupation of Manchuria occurred in September of 1931. Japan proclaimed a sovereign state Manchukuo, which was ruled by the puppet emperor, and last emperor of China, Puyi. Manchuria was the perfect place to set up a unit which would research the effects of biological and chemical warfare and how to use them effectively as a weapon against Japan's enemies. Far from the main island of Japan, Manchuria was the perfect secret location. The project of Unit 731 was first set up in the city of Harbin, but was destroyed after a group of prisoners blew up the laboratory, forcing Ishii to find another suitable location. Unit 731's title for the public was Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit of the Guangdong Army, seeming harmless and rather proactive. On August 1, 1936, Ishii was given formal command of the unit. After the Marco Polo Bridge incident in 1937, Japan's war in China escalated. The laboratory in Pingfen was set in 3 square kilometers of land, and the facilities were hidden by a high wall, and protected by many high-voltage wires. The land had around 150 buildings, including housing for those captured, an incinerator, an animal house, an airfield. From an aerial view, blocks 7 and 8 were hidden from the naked eye. These buildings, however, were the hotspots for bacteria production and research. A young recruit describes his first impression of Pingfen. The central building, towering skyward over other building, with all square-tiled facades, were larger than any of those I had observed on my trip over, including Osaka, Hsinking and Harbin. These buildings, reflecting the sunlight, glistened in brilliant white and broke into the vast sky. High earth walls were constructed with barbed wire fencing atop. It was obvious that this compound was isolated strictly from the outside world. Unit 731 was broken into 8 different divisions. First Division, Bacteriological Research. 2nd Division Warfare Research and Field Experiments. 3rd Division Water Filter Production. 4th Division Bacteria Mass Production and Storage. 5th Division Educational Division. 6th Division Supplies Division. 7th Division General Affairs. 8th Division Clinical Diagnosis. The secrecy of Unit 731 always remained a priority for the operation. Members of the unit were transported in and out of Pingfen in covered cargo trucks, while the trucks' registration tags never remained the same, being changed for protection frequently. When researching which method was best to disperse a virus or disease, Ishii arrived at the conclusion that dispersing internal pathogens in water supplies would be much more effective than by air dispersion. Pingfen was producing 300 kilograms of plague germs and bacteria at one point. At Unit 731's height, the production plant had the capacity to create enough bacteria to kill the entire world's population several times over. In 1941, Ishii discovered his greatest ally, the flea. Ishii understood that fleas ingest around 5,000 plague organisms once feeding from a rat suffering from disease, and when the flea stops sucking blood from its victim, may drive back into the bite wound highly infective blood. The infective flea may regurgitate as many as 10,000 to 24,000 organisms at one biting. Some of these usually enter the blood of the new host who, if susceptible, contracts bubonic or septicemia plague. Ishii found that an infective flea, with its blocked gullet, could live and carry its deadly bit for up to 1 month, and a single bit was found to be sufficient to cause infection. Innocent Chinese who had been captured were the patients to such tests. Ishii's secret of secrets was kept from thousands of employees at Unit 731. Prisoners would pass through tunnel entrances to the death blocks of Blocks 7 and 8, never to return again. The only thing guaranteed when entering either of these blocks was death and pain. The reason Ishii chose the remote location of Manchuria was in order to test specifically on live human subjects. Ishii accumulated most of his subjects from a detention camp called Hagoan in Pingfen. Russians who would not cooperate and give any information after being housed at Hagoan would be sent straight to Unit 731. Though, 70% of the humans used were Chinese. Unsuspecting and innocent people were also tricked into the clutches of Unit 731. Some were lured by the prospect of employment. Young boys, mothers, and children, even pregnant women, were trapped. Throughout the existence of Unit 731 in Pingfen, 3,000 people were sacrificed. The prison was a vision of hell. Through the sifily cut in the steel doors of each cell, the plight of the chained prisoners could be seen. Some had rotting limbs, bits of bone protruding through skin blackened by necrosis. Others were sweating in high fever, writhing in agony or moaning in pain. Those who suffered from respiratory infections coughed incessantly. Some were bloated, some emaciated, and others were blistered or had open wounds. Many of the cells were communal. An infected person would be put with healthy prisoners to see how easily diseases spread. In desperation, prisoners would try to practice primitive preventive medicine to escape contagion. Female prisoners were raped daily and was almost routine among the guards. The doctors used various methods of dispersing the diseases. They could be sprayed invisibly, in gas chambers, or in food, drink, chocolates, melons, or crackers. Dr. Suio Okamoto, a young serologist sent from the Tokyo Imperial University in Manchuria, recalls what he saw when first arriving. I was very shocked when I arrived and found out about the human experiments. Very few of those scientists had a sense of conscience. They treated the prisoners like animals. The prisoners were the enemy, they would eventually be sentenced to death. They thought the prisoners would die an honorable death if, in the process, they contributed to the progress of medical science. I was very frightened, although my work involved no human experiments. I wrote my resignation to Majgen Kikuchi, the research chief, 3 or 4 times. But there was no way to get out. I was told that if I left I might secretly be executed. Experiments included vivisection without anesthesia. Vivisections were performed while the prisoners were alive because it was thought that the decomposition process would affect the results. Men, women, children, and infants were subject to this kind of vivisection. Vivisections performed on pregnant women, often women who had been impregnated by the doctors themselves. Limbs being amputated from prisoners to further study blood loss. Limbs having been removed were often reattached to opposite sides of the body. Some prisoners' limbs would be frozen and amputated, while other prisoners had limbs frozen and then thawed out to fully study the effects of rotting and possible gangrene. Some prisoners had their stomachs removed while alive. Prisoners would be hung upside down to see exactly how long one dies before being choked to death. Having horse urine injected into prisoners' kidneys. Starvation. Prisoners would be exposed to extremely high and low temperatures in order to develop frostbite. Doctors would study how long a human being could survive before rotting and gangrene set in on human flesh. Extreme high temperatures were used to determine the relationship between temperature and human survival. Exposed to lethal dosages of X-ray radiation. Besides prisoners being subjected to such testing, it is said that up to 400,000 Chinese civilians died due to their being exposed to viruses such as cholera and anthrax, which were spread by air droppings of infected paper and mundane items. Who was involved? General Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist who studied medicine at Japan's prestigious Kyoto Imperial University. In 1920, after Ishii completed university, he joined the Army Medical Corps. To Ishii's disappointment, the Geneva Protocol was signed in 1925 banning the use of asphyxiating, poisonous or other gases, and of bacteriological methods of warfare. He became adamant about the creation of a Japanese bacteriological weapons program, insisting that if the protocol prohibited such weapons, they must be extremely effective. In 1928, Ishii decided to tour the Western Hemisphere, specifically the United States and Europe. The reason for Ishii's trip was to gather as much information as he could from the powerful Western countries and to learn all he could about the use of bacteriological weapons in World War I. Ishii returned to Japan 2 years later and was appointed professor of immunology at the Tokyo Army Medical School and was appointed major. With the much-needed help from Sadao Araki, Japanese appointed Minister of War in 1931, Ishii was finally given permission and the means to set up a secret research laboratory in the newly Japanese-invaded province of Manchuria in China. At a formal gathering in 1936 celebrating the commencement of the project, General Ishii outlined the purpose of the laboratory. He told those who gathered that our God-given mission as doctors is to challenge all varieties of disease-causing microorganisms, to block all roads of intrusion into the human body, to annihilate all foreign matter resident in our bodies, and to devise the most expeditious treatment possible. However, the research upon which we are now about to embark is the complete opposite of these principles, and may cause us some anguish as doctors. Nevertheless, I beseech you to pursue this research based on the double medical thrill: 1. A scientist to exert effort to probing for the truth in natural science and research into, and discovery of, the unknown world, and 2, as a military person, to successfully build a powerful military weapon against the enemy. In 1945, after the camp had been closed down, Ishii anticipated the grave danger he was in for what he had done, and faked his own death. The Americans quickly learned that he had gone into hiding and demanded he be turned over by the Japanese to be questioned. American officials began to interrogate Ishii, and though at first he refused to be involved in the project in any way, he realized that the Russians who wanted to speak with him might not be as kind in their methods as the Americans. He agreed to tell the Americans all they questioned about, as long as he was given immunity from war crimes prosecution. The Americans were anxious to learn what Ishii knew, so they agreed to his terms. Ishii's knowledge was not as astounding as the Americans had thought, but in compliance with their agreement, Ishii walked away a free man. Ishii was never tried as a war criminal by any of the Allies and died of throat cancer at the age of 67 in 1959. Masaji Kitano, a microbiologist, and lieutenant general in the Imperial Japanese Army. Kitano was second in command to Shiro Ishii of Unit 731. Kitano graduated from Tokyo Imperial University's School of Medicine, like Shiro Ishii. Masaji may not be as well known as Ishii, but throughout my research it appears that he was just as much of a moral monster, if not greater upon taking control of Unit 731. He succeeded Ishii for 2.5 years after 1942 as commander of Unit 731. During this time Kitano was extremely interested in the new Songo disease. After a mutant form of an epidemic appeared in Songo in 1943, Kitano wrote, "When the epidemic broke out in Songo, I went to the epidemic site and conducted tests. Diagnosing the infection process, I believed it had most necessary to examine ticks being carried by rats. I had Asahina collect a kind of Tajdani thorny tick, Lelaps jetmar, Vitsithum attached to Sishijinazumi rat apati musicarius. On November 6, Dr. Kanazawa performed tests on these ticks. Subsequently Dr. Kasahara took over the tests. On December 14 of the same year I received the pathological opinion of Dr. Ishikawa and knew the success of our experiment. After that Dr. Kasahara et al. Made much effort to determine that the agin was a virus. When Dr. Ishikawa was transferred to Kanazawa University, Dr. Tokuro took over pathological study and was successful in that work. Dr. Shiro Kasahara, no picture was available. Kasahara was possibly the only person, besides those who were tested on, working at Unit 731 who had a sense of morals and compassion for human life. Kasahara was drafted in 1939 from Kitasato Research Institute in Tokyo. He was a talented virologist, and was adamant about researching a fairly new disease that had broken out in Songo, close to the Soviet border. Kasahara writes, "I was told to go to Manchuria and work in the Ishii unit. I was very, very reluctant, but at the time all the population, 100 million Japanese, were mobilized for war, so I had no chance to refuse the proposal." Ishii was recruiting all those talented medical scientists who had the rank of assistant professor, or even hospital medical director. And for the people who refused to come to Manchuria he arranged that they were sent a dreadnought. I was just a civilian member of the unit. I was called laboratory technician or something like that. In there, those officers who had military rank had great power to control everything. During the first 12 months, I studied the mysterious disease called Songo fever which had broken out in northern Manchuria near the Soviet border. I went there with other officers and medical doctors to investigate the disease, though that it was caused by a kind of virus and we named it Songo fever. My work involved supervising the extraction of blood samples from cases previously injected. They would normally show a slight temperature rise to about 37 deg C. These samples were re-injected into a second spy by members of another section, which had nothing to do with mine, and, after the injection, the second generation of patient became infected with hemorrhagic fever. From the symptoms we were able to discern the transmission of the strain. When I went to the unit for the second time in 1942 I had to participate in the experiments of Kitano and the military doctors that were already in progress, namely, injecting people, spies. This was the result of orders and simply had to be obeyed. I feel very guilty about what I have done and I think I did wrong. There were very few instances, but, when a spy did die as a result of human experiment, I felt terribly sad and I always arranged for a memorial service to be held in the main hall of the Ishii unit, which was given by a Buddhist prize from among the soldiers, but that's how deeply I was disturbed, and I think I was the only person in the Ishii unit to arrange such a memorial service. Yoshio Shinozuka was an Imperial Army soldier who served in Unit 731, specifically by performing experiments and vivisections those captured in China. Recently, in 1997 he gave testimony in regards to the activities of Unit 731. 180 Chinese were suing the government of Japan for compensation in addition to a formal apology for the agonizing deaths of family members claimed to have been killed in the laboratory of Unit 731. Shinozuka said, "I was a member of Unit 731 and I have done what no human being should ever do." Shinozuka tried to give a speech at a peace conference in the United States but was denied since he had been a war criminal. Though, like Ishii and most others who were involved in Unit 731, he received immunization from the United States in exchange for providing results of the experiments. The science behind Unit 731 involved biological and chemical warfare. Thousands of doctors and scientists were recruited to the unit in order to conduct experiments on live human subjects. The focus of the unit was researching two things: biological and chemical warfare offense and biological and chemical warfare defense. As seen above, the scientists inflicted various types of diseases upon the prisoners, and much research was done on how to effectively disperse the diseases if Japan was ever able to do so. Types of discovered chemical munitions and toxic agents abandoned in China by a foreign state. 1. Types of munitions. 1. 150 mm chemical shells, shells containing a mustard gas Lewisite mixture and shells containing diphenylcyanorcine. 2. 105 mm chemical shells, shells containing a mustard gas Lewisite mixture and shells containing diphenylcyanorcine. 3. 90 mm chemical mortar shells containing a mustard gas Lewisite mixture and mortar shells containing diphenylcyanorcine. 4. 75 mm phosgene shells and diphenylcyanorcine. 5. Chemical aerial bombs, 81 mm chemical mortar shells, and chemical munitions of other calibers as well as toxic smoke candles and canisters. 2. Types of toxic agents. Main types of toxic agents include mustard gas Lewisite mixture, diphenylcyanorcine, hydrocyanic acid, phosgene, chloroacetophenone. Stay paranoid, my friends.